So I promise I am going to be doing my literary analysis of Pride and Prejudice soon. I just want to talk about something I read in the introduction of my Penguin cloth-bound copy, which the introductions are pretty much like an academic essay written about the book. And in the beginning, the author of the introduction says that famously Austen had described this novel as rather too light and bright and sparkling. And Pride and Prejudice is essentially concerned with personal happiness and the grounds on which it might be achieved, and Elizabeth's marriage to Darcy, tall, handsome, and rich, is the stuff of wish fulfillment. And I never really thought of it like that, but it's true. It's probably why it's done so well both today and of its time, is because of it being so fantastical, because technically it's a rags to riches story, which is odd to think about. But if you look at her other pairings, like Emma and Mr. Knightley, or equal footing, for instance, they're both well-to-do landed gentry and pillars of their community. Even Anne Elliot, who is the daughter of a baron, is on equal footing as Captain Wentworth because of his wealth and her lack thereof. With Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth, despite them both being within the same class, as Lizzie says, she's a daughter of a gentleman, there is an obvious difference thanks to the economic standing between Lizzie, who is Miss Bennet of Longbourn, versus who she becomes as Miss Darcy of Pemberley. Her father, yes, might be a landed gentry, but I don't believe has any tenants, or if he does, has very few. Obviously doesn't have much of an income coming in. And she's not super influential. Like, she is and she isn't within her community, because there are a handful of other families within the same equal social economic standing as her own. When Bingley comes in, he does have influence because he does have money. That's why they all look to him and they expect him to host a ball, because that's what's expected. The next runner-up would be like Charlotte Lucas's father, who is a Sir Lucas because he was knighted by nobility, or by the royalty. But Mr. Darcy of Pemberley has plenty of tenants. He is the kind of leader of his community, of his county that they look towards. You hear from her aunt, who had lived within that community, how influential they are, and she has more wealth, power, and influence. So she is kind of going from rags to riches, but it doesn't feel like that compared to, say, others of her contemporary time, which again explains why Pride and Prejudice did so well during her time, because it is very similar to, for example, Samuel Richardson's Pamela, where we have a maid who was pretty much being sexually harassed by her boss's son, who's a lord, but she kept deterring him and stuck to her morals and virtues for so long that eventually he fell in love with her and they got married. And this story was so popular at its time and was like published by its chapters, like incrementally, kind of like Charles Dickens, that when they finally got to the chapter that she got married, there's tales of how a handful of churches across England rang the bells in celebration. And you've seen a maid marry a lord because she's kept to her virtues and morals and all that. Same with Frances Burney Evelina. Now, Frances Burney was very influential to Jane Austen. We know she's a big fan. She was a subscriber to her works. But Evelina, we know her parents are okay, but we don't know much about her parents. She's been raised by a country reverend, so it's kind of a country mouse. But because of her beauty and her grace and kindness and morals and virtues, she eventually wins in the end and marries Lord Orville. So she, again, climbs. It's a rags to riches story. And the fascinating thing is that, like I said, all of Jane Austen's other stories feel more commonplace, like something you would probably more likely to come across, the marriages you're more likely to come across than, say, Lizzie and Mr. Darcy. Even Charlotte Lucas and Mr. Collins makes sense. That's probably the most likely pairing you're going to come across in real life versus Lizzie and Mr. Darcy. It's a dream, it's a fantasy, it's fantastical, but it doesn't feel like that. I think because it doesn't feel like a rags of riches, because Lizzie doesn't talk about those kind of things as much as her other stories. We feel the pressure of money in other stories, such as with Anne Elliot in Persuasion, or Eleanor Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility, or even Fanny in Mansfield Park when she is sent back home to her birth parents. Then, like her social economic standing, she feels it a lot more than she did before. Lizzie never feels that, despite technically having the pressure that when her father dies, they're kind of left hanging, like there's nothing there for them, with thanks to the entail and all this, that she should feel the pressure, but she doesn't. So it's so much more fantastical because she doesn't feel that pressure. Not like, for example, Georgette Harrow's Arabella, which is her version of Pride and Prejudice, which she describes as that, and like the author who did the introduction of the book that I read, the version I read, described it as her version of Pride and Prejudice. Arabella very much feels that she knows that she's getting a once in a lifetime opportunity to go to London and marry well to help her family. It all works out in the end, and even like the love interest is more comedic than Mr. Darcy. But the point of this I'm trying to say is that it's fascinating that this is her most light and fluffy, and it's because it is technically a rags to riches story. And Lizzie, for example, doesn't feel the pressures that her other characters in her other books do, the everyday real life pressures. But what makes this different and slightly less fantastical than Evelina and Pamela is because she's not perfect. Lizzie isn't perfect. She's not, perfect like Evelina and Pamela. She has her flaws within her prejudices and her proudness. And that's what makes it a little different. So I read that little excerpt. I wanted to talk about it a little bit. This is kind of rambling, but also something I thought would be fascinating to kind of bring up and oil the wheel before we dig into the literary analysis, to think about how this is kind of a rags to riches story and what makes it different from other rags to riches stories, and what is the commentary that Jane Austen is having, but also explain why probably Pride and Prejudice did so well, not only in its day, but still today. So please subscribe, follow, so you can be notified when I do post my literary analysis, which should hopefully be soon. But thank you for watching and listening to this, and I hope to see you in the future. Thank you.